Those are tattoos, Dr. Hannah Vale asked, and the way her voice caught made the whole room feel smaller. Caleb Mercer didn't answer right away. He just sat there on the exam table in a plain gray shirt, one sleeve pushed up, his eyes fixed on the window like he was listening to something no one else could hear. The late shift lights in Aegis Station's medical bay threw a soft white glow over his skin, and the dark lines wrapped around his forearm looked too precise to be decoration, too deliberate to be random. Hannah leaned a little closer, careful, curious, almost offended by how calm he was. "I mean it," she said, lowering her voice. "Those look like tattoos." Caleb finally looked at her. He had the kind of face that never seemed to ask for attention, the kind people forgot until they needed help. "Depends who's asking," he said. Hannah blinked once, then gave a short breath that was almost a laugh. "I'm asking because I've never seen ink laid out like that. It follows the muscle groups." "That's because it wasn't drawn to impress anybody." From the doorway, Nolan Pierce watched with his hands behind his back, posture straight, expression polite in the way only truly dangerous men could manage. He was Aegis Station's director of security, which meant he smiled like a host and spoke like a man reading a report about a problem he planned to own. "Mr. Mercer," Nolan said, "for station records, I'd appreciate a straight answer." Caleb glanced at him, then back at Hannah. "You won't like it. Try us," Nolan said. Caleb rubbed a thumb along one of the dark lines on his wrist, like he was checking whether it was still there, whether the memory still held. "They're not decorations," he said. "They're reminders." Hannah frowned. "Reminders of what?" Caleb looked down at his hand for a second, and when he spoke again, his voice stayed level, almost gentle. "Of what happens when people stop being careful with themselves." The silence after that felt heavy enough to touch. Outside the medical bay, the station hummed with its usual evening rhythm. Soft footsteps in the corridor, a distant cart rolling over polished metal, the low mechanical breath of recycled air. Inside, nobody moved. Hannah's curiosity had turned into something sharper, something she could not name yet. Nolan, meanwhile, had already started thinking in terms of utility. A man with a body map like this was either a liability or a weapon. There was no third option, not in Nolan's world. Caleb noticed the shift in both of them. He always noticed. "You can run the scan," he said. "You can pull every file you want. It still won't tell you the part you actually care about." "And what part is that?" Hannah asked. Caleb met her eyes, steady and tired at the same time. "Why I still have them." For the first time since he walked in, the room felt honest. Not safe. Honest. Hannah glanced at the markings again, and something about the shape of them made her uneasy in a way she did not want to admit. Not because they were strange, because they looked intentional, controlled, like someone had once been dangerous enough to need a map back to himself. Nolan stepped forward half a pace. "Then let's start there," he said. Caleb gave him a small, unreadable look, and in that look there was no fear, no arrogance, only the quiet patience of a man who had survived long enough to know exactly how much of himself to reveal. "We can," he said. "But you should know, once you start asking the wrong questions, you usually don't like the answers." Hannah did not answer right away. She was still looking at Caleb's arm, at the dark lines that wrapped around his skin with the kind of precision people usually only saw in machine parts and military diagrams. Nolan broke the silence first. "Run the scan," he said, nodding toward the medical console. "Full depth. I want every layer." Caleb gave a small, tired shrug, like the idea did not impress him one bit. "Go ahead," he said. "It will not tell you what you think it will." Hannah hesitated, then slid her fingers across the glass panel. The scanner hummed softly and swept a pale blue line over his forearm, then his shoulder, then the side of his neck where one more mark disappeared under the collar of his shirt. Her screen filled with clean data, but the more she looked, the less normal it seemed. The lines were not random. They sat over points the station medical software tagged as nerve clusters, balance control, muscle memory, stress response. She frowned and zoomed in. "These are placed on purpose," she said quietly. Caleb nodded once. "That is usually how purpose works." Nolan's mouth tightened. "Purpose for what?" Caleb leaned back against the exam table and stared at the ceiling for a second, as if the answer had a weight he did not enjoy carrying. "For staying in one piece." The comm panel on the wall chimed before anyone could answer. A comm station voice cut through the room. "Attention, all personnel. There has been a temporary systems fault in Sector C. Please remain where you are and await instructions from security. Nolan's eyes shifted at once. He tapped his wrist control and the message repeated with a slight delay, then again, now with a softer, almost smoothed-out edge that made Hannah uneasy. That is not a routine fault, he said. Caleb straightened. It was barely a movement, but the whole room changed with it. He had gone from relaxed to alert in one breath. No, he said. It is not. Hannah looked between them. What is happening? Nolan was already moving toward the door. A containment issue, most likely, he said, too quickly. Stay here. Caleb was already on his feet. That was not your real message. Nolan paused with his hand on the frame. Excuse me. Caleb tilted his head, watching him with that same quiet focus from before. You just checked the hall before you spoke. That means you already knew something was wrong. Nolan held his stare for half a second too long. Then he smiled, thin and polite. You are observant. And you are nervous, Caleb said. Hannah felt her stomach tighten. Nolan stepped into the corridor, and the door slid shut behind him with a clean metallic hiss. For a moment, there was only the low hum of the lights and the soft rhythm of the station breathing around them. Then the floor gave a faint tremor under their feet. Not enough to knock anyone over. Just enough to make Hannah grip the edge of the counter. She turned toward the window in time to see a strip of corridor lights go amber, one after another, disappearing deeper into the station like a warning being passed hand to hand. Caleb was already moving toward the door. Stay close, he said. Hannah blinked. You are telling me that now? He glanced back at her, calm but sharper than before. You asked for the truth. This is the part where things stop being polite. : Caleb stepped into the corridor first, moving with the kind of quiet certainty that made Hannah trust him even before she understood why. The amber lights pulsed overhead in a slow chain, and the usual station noise had thinned into something strange and hollow, like the whole place was holding its breath. Hannah stayed close enough to see the tension in the back of his jaw, not from fear, but from recognition. This happens a lot? She asked as they turned the corner. Not like this, Caleb said. Not on a station this well-run. That answer bothered her more than she wanted to admit. A maintenance cart sat abandoned near the wall, one wheel still spinning. A half-finished cup of coffee had tipped onto the floor and spread in a dark crescent across the metal grating. Nothing looked broken, and that was exactly what made it feel wrong. Caleb crouched beside the cart, touched the edge of a service panel, then lifted his hand and looked at the smudge of fresh residue on his fingertips. Someone was here a minute ago, he said. Not maintenance. Hannah frowned. How do you know? He glanced at the residue, then at the ceiling camera that was pointing a few degrees too far to the left. Because they wanted the camera to miss them. She followed his gaze and felt her skin prickle. Nolan had said stay in the medical bay. Nolan had walked out too quickly. Now the station was rerouting people away from Sector C, and every message on the wall panels had the same clean, careful wording that sounded official right up until you listened closely. Containment issue. Temporary fault. Please remain calm. Caleb rose and started moving again, a little faster now. Hannah quickened her pace to keep up. You look like you know where you are going, she said. I do, he replied. That is the part one do not like. She almost asked him what that meant, but the next bend in the corridor opened onto a wide observation passage, and both of them stopped. Through the thick, transparent wall, she could see the station's central transit spine stretching out like a bright metal artery, with small groups of people being guided into side corridors by security staff in dark uniforms. No one was panicking. That made it worse. Everything looked orderly from a distance. Too orderly. Caleb's eyes narrowed. There, he said softly. Hannah followed his line of sight to a sealed service door at the far end of the spine. A pair of technicians stood beside it, checking badges that were not being scanned by the station system. One of them wore Nolan Pierce's security insignia. The other had no insignia at all. What are they doing? She asked. Caleb did not answer right away. He was watching the door like it had just become the most important thing on the station. Then he said, very quietly, they are not fixing anything. They are moving something. Hannah felt her pulse kick up. Something meaning what? Caleb's expression did not change, but his voice dropped another notch. Meaning this was planned. Before she could respond, the corridor speakers clicked on again. Nolan's voice filled the passage, smooth and controlled, almost pleasant. Dr. Vale, report to Security Office 3 immediately. Mr. Mercer, you are also requested. Do not take any side routes. Do not interfere with station operations. Thank you for your cooperation. Caleb looked at the speaker for a long second, then at Hannah. Now you know why I said things stop being polite. Caleb did not waste a second after the speaker went silent. He moved down the corridor with Hannah right behind him, one hand already reaching for the manual latch on the service door at the end of the hall. The moment he touched it, the panel flashed red and locked tighter. A calm synthetic voice filled the air. Access denied. Security clearance required. Caleb let out a slow breath through his nose. Of course it is. Hannah looked around the hallway, then back at him. You sound like this is normal. It is normal when somebody wants you in one place and everybody else somewhere else. He crouched, studied the seam around the door, then stood again and turned toward a wall console beside a maintenance hatch. His fingers moved fast over the keys, not frantic, just sure. Hannah watched the station map on the screen flicker and recompile, whole corridors blinking out, rerouting, and then returning under different labels. You can do that? She asked. I used to fix broken systems for a living, Caleb said. Now I mostly try not to let them fix me. That almost got a smile out of her, but the sound of hurried footsteps cut through the corridor before she could answer. 3 station security officers rounded the corner, uniforms sharp, weapons lowered but ready, their expressions too stiff to be casual. Nolan was not with them. That was worse. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man with a tired face, stopped a few feet away. Dr. Vale, Mr. Mercer, he said, voice clipped. You need to come with us now. Caleb did not move. Who issued the order? The officer hesitated. Just long enough. Security Director Pierce. Hannah noticed it too. Caleb noticed it first. Not enough, he said. You are going to tell me why Sector C has been sealed. The officer's jaw tightened. That information is above my level. Then your level is too low, Caleb replied. For a second, nobody spoke. The corridor lights hummed overhead, and the station somewhere deep behind the walls gave a low mechanical shiver, like a giant machine shifting in its sleep. One of the officers glanced at the maintenance hatch, then back at Caleb's hands. He had seen the maps changing. He had seen enough to know this was no routine escort. Hannah moved half a step closer to Caleb without meaning to. What is in Sector C? She asked. The officer did not answer. Instead, the lead man touched his earpiece, listened, then looked visibly uneasy. We have an unresolved situation, he said carefully. Please do not make this harder. Caleb gave a short, humorless nod. That means you do not know either. Before the officer could react, the ceiling lights snapped off for half a second, then came back on in a dim emergency glow. A warning tone rolled through the corridor, low and flat, the kind that made the skin feel too tight. The officers turned at once, and Caleb reached for Hannah's wrist, not hard, just enough to move her back. Stay behind me, he said. Now. She did not argue. In the red light, his tattoos looked darker, almost alive, and Hannah suddenly understood that the marks on his arm were not there to be noticed. They were there to be remembered. Above them, somewhere past the sealed door, something had just changed. The warning tone kept rolling through the corridor, low and steady, like the station itself was trying not to panic. Caleb did not take his eyes off the security officers. Nobody touches anything, he said, calm enough to sound rude. The lead officer shifted his weight, clearly torn between following orders and trusting the man in front of him. Sir, I need you to step back. Caleb gave him a flat look. Then you need better orders. Hannah could feel the strain in the air now, the way everybody was waiting for someone else to be the first to make a mistake. One of the officers touched his earpiece again, then frowned. Director Pierce is requesting immediate clearance in Sector C, he said. He says the situation has escalated. Caleb's face changed at that. Not much, just enough for Hannah to notice. Escalated how? The officer looked almost embarrassed. He did not say. Caleb exhaled once through his nose. Of course he did not. Hannah looked from the officers to Caleb and back again. You know what they are hiding, do not you? She asked. Caleb did not answer right away. He reached into the inner pocket of his shirt and pulled out a small metal disc about the size of a coin. It was worn smooth at the edges, the sort of thing people kept too long because it had been important to someone once. He held it for a second between his thumb and forefinger, then pressed it into Hannah's hand. If I tell you one thing right now, he said, I need you to hear it all the way through. Her fingers closed around the disc automatically. Okay. Caleb looked toward the sealed service door at the end of the hall. Sector C is not a maintenance wing. Nolan's voice came through the corridor speakers before anybody else could react. That is correct, he said, crisp and unmistakably pleased with himself. It is a restricted archive and containment corridor, which is exactly why I need everyone away from it. The officers straightened at once. Hannah heard the difference in their posture before she fully understood the words. Nolan had just told them enough to make the room sound official, not enough to make it sound safe. The speaker clicked again. Mr. Mercer, you have exceeded your access privileges. Dr. Vale, remain where you are. This is now a matter for station security. Caleb stared at the ceiling speaker for a long beat, then laughed under his breath, but there was no humor in it. He always talks like that when he is lying. One of the officers shifted closer, trying to keep the moment under control. You know Director Pierce personally? He asked. Caleb looked at him. I know the kind of man who seals a hallway, reroutes the cameras, and uses the word containment when he means problem. That answer landed hard enough that even the officers went still. The floor tremored again, stronger this time, and a distant mechanical clang echoed from somewhere deeper in the station. Not an explosion, not a collapse, something unlocking. Hannah felt her pulse kick up. Caleb, she said, quieter now, what is in there? He looked at the sealed door, then back at her, and the answer in his eyes was worse than anything he could have said out loud. Something Nolan should never have pulled out of storage. The corridor lights shifted from amber to red, and every display panel along the wall went blank at once. For one breathless second, the entire station seemed to stop. Then the sealed service door ahead gave a soft mechanical click and began to open. Caleb stepped in front of Hannah without thinking, one hand low, the other already moving toward the side of the doorway, his body suddenly all focus and stillness. Whatever happens next, he said, barely above a whisper, do not let Pierce tell you this was an accident. Yesh. The door opened just enough for a strip of cold white light to spill into the corridor, and everyone in the hall felt it at the same time. Hannah took one step forward before Caleb lifted an arm in front of her, stopping her without looking away from the opening. The officers beside them were frozen now, their hands hovering near their belts, not because they wanted trouble, but because they had no idea what kind of trouble was waiting on the other side. Nolan Pierce appeared in the gap a moment later, smooth, composed, and wearing the kind of calm that never belonged to a man doing honest work. He did not look surprised to see Caleb. He looked annoyed that Caleb was still there. Well, Nolan said, brushing one hand across the front of his uniform. This is inconvenient. Hannah stared at him. What did you put in there? Nolan gave her a small smile that never reached his eyes. Something that belongs to the station. Caleb's voice stayed level. That is not what you told the board. Nolan's smile thinned. I told the board what they needed to hear. He stepped fully into the corridor, and the officers immediately straightened, unsure whether they were supposed to protect him or watch him. You have no idea how much money this place burns every hour, Nolan said, glancing at the sealed door behind him as if it were a cabinet he had just finished unlocking. Do you know what happens when a company cannot control what it owns? Hannah looked from one face to the other. You are not talking about maintenance anymore. No, Nolan said, almost cheerfully. I am talking about leverage. Caleb finally moved, just one step forward, and the whole air around him changed. You used the archive wing as cover, he said. You moved restricted material through a public corridor. You rerouted security, altered the logs, and shut down the cameras. Nolan lifted one shoulder in a mild shrug. I improved efficiency. You lied to everyone. Of course I lied, Nolan said. People panic when they are told the truth too early. Hannah let out a quiet breath, not from fear now, but from anger. Truth about what? Nolan looked at her, as though she were the only person in the room who might still be reasonable. About assets. About possibilities. About what your friend here is really worth. Caleb let out a tired laugh. I am not your asset. No, Nolan said. Then explain why your file was removed from the civilian registry before you even arrived here. The question landed hard. Hannah turned sharply toward Caleb. He did not answer, which was answer enough. Nolan saw it and took a slow step closer, sensing the room tilt in his favor. I ran your background the moment you checked in, he said. You should have seen your own record. There are sections of your service history that were never meant to exist outside military clearance. The markings on your arm, the medical oddities, the survival times that make no sense. You are not a curiosity, Mr. Mercer. You are evidence. Caleb looked at him for a long second, then said, "That is what you pulled out of storage." Nolan's expression changed for the first time. Not fear. Not yet. Just the smallest crack of irritation, because Caleb had said it correctly. "Yes," he said. "And now every department on this station knows your name." The wall display behind them flashed alive all at once, showing a station-wide alert scrolling across every screen in the corridor. Unauthorized research event. Security review in progress. Report to designated checkpoints. Hannah read it and felt her stomach drop. Nolan had not just opened a door. He had turned the entire station into an audience. Caleb stared at the alert, then back at Nolan, and the silence that followed was heavier than any raised voice. Nolan adjusted his cuffs again, perfectly calm, like a man who had just won a game by changing the rules mid-match. "Now," he said softly, "let us see what the galaxy thinks those tattoos are worth." Hannah stared at the station alert scrolling across every screen in the corridor, and for a second, she could not even tell whether she was angry or just stunned that Nolan had done this so cleanly, so publicly, like he had been waiting for the exact moment when everyone would be forced to listen. A few meters away, the officers were looking from one face to another, trying to understand which order mattered now. Caleb did not move. He just kept his eyes on Nolan. "You really want to do this here?" Caleb asked. Nolan folded his hands behind his back and glanced at the corridor cameras, as if they were part of his audience. "I already am doing it here," he said. "The only difference is that now the whole station can see it." Hannah took a slow breath. "See what exactly?" Nolan turned to her with a calm that felt rehearsed. "See that Security Director Pierce is protecting this station from an unknown risk that has been sitting in plain sight." Caleb gave a quiet, almost tired shake of his head. "You are not protecting anybody." Nolan's mouth tightened. "You say that because you have spent your whole life hiding what you are." That landed harder than anything he had said so far. Hannah looked at Caleb, waiting for him to deny it, but he did not. He only stood there with his shoulders loose and his expression flat, like a man who had been cornered too many times to waste energy being surprised. Nolan saw the silence and leaned into it. "You are not a civilian," he said. "You are not a repairman, not a contractor, and not some unlucky passenger who wandered into the wrong wing. Your file shows military erasures, medical anomalies, restricted travel routes, and a service record that was redacted by 3 separate agencies. That does not happen to ordinary people." Caleb finally spoke. "No, it does not." Nolan pointed lightly toward him, as though addressing a room full of investors. "Exactly. Which means whatever you were built for, trained for, or survived for, it is worth knowing about." Hannah felt the floor of the whole conversation shift. Built for, trained for, survived for. Those words made the tattoos on Caleb's arm feel different now, less like art and more like a map with the meaning stripped away. "You were trying to use me," Caleb said. Nolan gave him a small shrug. "I was trying to understand you before somebody else did." "That is not the same thing. It is when the wrong person gets there first." Nolan took one step closer, then stopped, careful not to crowd him too much. "Do you know why I opened that door?" he asked. "Because you were never going to hand over the answers willingly. I needed the station to see the problem for itself." Caleb looked past him toward the bright wall screens, where the alert was still looping across every deck and department. "So now I am a problem," he said. "Now you are a decision," Nolan replied. Hannah could feel the trap closing in around the room. If Caleb stayed quiet, Nolan would control the story. If Caleb spoke, he would be forced to explain things he clearly did not want to explain. Either way, the station had already been turned into a witness. Then Caleb reached into his pocket and pulled out the little metal disc he had given Hannah earlier. He held it up between 2 fingers so Nolan could see it. "You know what this is?" he asked. Nolan did not answer right away, and that tiny hesitation gave Caleb exactly what he needed. "It is the only reason I am still on this station instead of in a sealed file somewhere you cannot open." The corridor went silent. Even the officers stopped shifting their feet. Hannah looked down at the disc in Caleb's hand and then back up at his face. For the first time since she had met him, she realized he was not waiting for permission from anyone in the hallway. He had already decided this was the moment to stop being careful. Nolan's expression changed by a fraction, just enough to show that the game had moved somewhere he did not fully control anymore. Then explain it, he said. Caleb looked straight at him, steady as stone. Not here. The answer was calm, but it changed everything. Because now Nolan knew he had pushed too far, and Hannah knew the real story was just beyond the next door. Caleb kept the disc between his fingers for one more second, then closed his hand around it, and turned away from Nolan as if the conversation had already ended. The corridor stayed frozen behind him, officers still unsure whether to stand down or step in, and Hannah realized that Caleb was no longer trying to win the room. He was trying to leave it before it got worse. Come on, he said to her, already walking. She followed without thinking, and Nolan's voice cut after them. That is not an option. Caleb did not look back. It stopped being your option the moment you lied to the station. The hallway beyond Sector C was nearly empty now, the red warning lights washing every surface in the same uneasy glow. They moved past a pair of sealed maintenance doors, then down a side passage that smelled faintly of ozone and floor cleaner. Hannah kept pace beside him, trying to read his face. What did you mean? She said quietly. When you said the disc was the only reason you are still here. Caleb gave a short, tired exhale. Because somebody wanted my record buried, and somebody else decided it should stay reachable. That answer only made her more suspicious. Who? He stopped in front of a narrow service lift and pressed the disc against a dark panel she had not noticed before. The reader lit up instantly. Not amber. Not red. Green. Hannah stared at the panel. You said you were not important enough for this place to know your name. Caleb stepped into the lift and held the door with one hand. I said I was not important enough for Nolan to own. The lift descended silently. When the doors opened again, they were in a small archive room hidden deep inside the station. All dull metal shelves and sealed cabinets. The kind of place nobody visited unless they were trying to make a record disappear. Hannah turned slowly in place, taking in the dust-free floor, the locked drawers, the single terminal already awake on the desk. This is yours, she said. Caleb shook his head once. No, it is what he thought he stole from me. He set the disk into the terminal, and a string of old security prompts flickered to life across the screen. Hannah leaned closer. File after file appeared, each one tagged with restricted clearance, each one older than the station itself. Her eyes caught on one line, then another. These are military medical records, she said. Caleb nodded. And the parts one was not supposed to have. She looked up at him. You were in service. A long time ago. Then why hide the file here? Caleb's jaw tightened just slightly. Because the thing Nolan pulled out of storage was not me. Hannah blinked. What does that mean? Caleb tapped the screen, and a second file opened. It was a sealed incident report, thin on details but heavy with consequences. Hannah read the first few lines, then looked back at him with a new kind of confusion. This says you voluntarily entered a recovery program after a controlled field event. That was the clean version, Caleb said. The real version was worse. I came back from a job I should not have survived in one piece, and the only way I could keep going was by learning how to put the brakes on myself. Hannah looked down at the tattoos again, and now they made terrible sense. Not decoration, not rebellion. Control. A map of restraint, laid across skin like a private promise. So that is what they are, she whispered. They are the reminders. Caleb nodded once. The last thing I wanted was to become the kind of man everybody expects when they hear the word human and think it means unstoppable. Before Hannah could answer, the archive terminal chimed. A new message appeared on the screen, flagged with Nolan Pierce's security seal. Caleb stared at it for a long second, then opened it. Only one sentence sat there in plain text. I know what was in Sector C, and now the station is going to learn what you are still trying to hide. Hannah read Nolan's message twice before she looked up. The room felt quieter than before, like the station itself was waiting to hear what Caleb would do next. He did not rush. He did not curse. He just stood there with one hand resting on the edge of the terminal, eyes fixed on the screen like the message had confirmed something he had known would come eventually. He is bluffing, Hannah said, but her voice did not carry much confidence. Caleb gave a small shake of his head. No, he is not bluffing. He is buying time. She looked at him. For what? Caleb let out a long breath and turned the terminal so she could see the rest of the archive folder. For the version of the story he wants the station to believe. He tapped the screen, and more files opened. Medical notes, clearance logs, recovery records, Training summaries. Nothing dramatic by itself, but together they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. Not a monster, not a weapon. A man who had once been pushed too close to the edge and then taught himself, with brutal patience, how not to fall off it again. Hannah scanned line after line, and her expression slowly changed from confusion to understanding. "You did all of this on purpose," she said softly. Caleb nodded. "Every mark, every reminder, every rule. Because you were afraid of what you could do." He considered the question for a moment before answering. "Because I knew exactly what I could do." That answer hung there, honest and plain. No pride in it. No shame either. Just the truth. Hannah looked back at the tattoos on his arm, then at the files, and something in her face settled into place. "Nolan saw the wrong thing," she said. Caleb gave a faint, tired smile. "That has been happening a lot today." The archive terminal chimed again. This time the message was not for Caleb. It was a station-wide alert, routed through the internal emergency channel. Hannah read the heading aloud, her voice growing steadier with each word. "Review of unauthorized research event. All department heads to secure conference access. Civilian personnel remain in place until further notice." Caleb closed his eyes for a second, then opened them again. "He is trying to control the room one more time. Can he?" Hannah asked. Caleb looked around the archive, at the sealed drawers, the old records, the small forgotten place where the truth had been buried and left to collect dust. Not anymore. He reached out and selected the final file in the folder. It was labeled with a title so plain it almost felt insulting. Personal statement. Hannah watched as he opened it, and a calm voice began to play from the speakers, his own voice, recorded sometime long before this moment. He spoke about service, about recovery, about the weight of surviving things that do not leave visible scars. He spoke about learning that being dangerous was not the same as being cruel, and that sometimes the hardest thing in the world was choosing restraint when nobody would have blamed you for the opposite. By the time the recording ended, Hannah had gone very still. "You kept this for when somebody would finally force the question," she said. "I kept it for when somebody stopped asking the wrong one," Caleb replied. Footsteps sounded in the corridor outside, then more voices, then the unmistakable pause of people reaching a door and realizing they were no longer in control of the room beyond it. The archive lights stayed steady. No alarms now. No threat tones. Just the low hum of a place where the truth had finally been allowed to breathe. Hannah looked at Caleb and then at the terminal, where the full file list sat in neat, unblinking order. "What happens now?" she asked. Caleb took the disk from the terminal and pressed it into her palm, closing her fingers around it. "Now they learn the difference between a secret and a lie," he said. "And maybe," he added after a beat, "they learn why some people carry their worst days in silence. Not because they are hiding something evil, but because they are trying very hard to stay good." When the archive door opened, Nolan was not smiling anymore. Behind him stood station leadership, medical staff, security, and a handful of people who had been ordered into the hallway by the alert and were now staring at the truth they had been told to ignore. Caleb did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply stood beside the terminal while Hannah took one step forward and said, clear enough for everyone to hear, "You all wanted to know what those markings meant. Now you know. They are proof that he chose control when he did not have to." And for the first time that day, the station went completely silent, not from fear, but from recognition.